Thank you so much for being here tonight. It truly means a lot that you choose to watch this channel. I've got a spine-chilling collection of scary stories set in the rain for you to enjoy. But before we dive in, take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let the darkness take over. And hey, if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe, never miss out on any of the eerie tales that we share. Sit back, relax, and let's get started. It was one of those northern Michigan summer evenings that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was still warm from the day's heat, but the coolness of night was just starting to settle in. My fiance, now my wife of almost 16 years, and I were hiking with another couple on the Pyramid Point Trail, which overlooks Lake Michigan's Manitou Passage. It was the perfect spot to catch a sunset, and that's exactly what we had in mind. The trail, lined with towering trees and dense underbrush, wound upward until we reached the Pyramid Point, overlook a stunning vista that made every step of the hike worthwhile. From there, the view stretched out for miles over the deep, blue expanse of Lake Michigan. In the distance, we could make out the Manitou Islands, their dark silhouettes just barely visible against the glowing orange sky. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and purple, we stood in awe. There's something about a sunset over a vast body of water that makes you feel small yet connected to everything around you. It was as if time had slowed down, and for a while, all that existed was the sound of the wind and the rhythmic crashing of waves far below us. By this time, it was probably close to 10 p.m., though the sky still held on to that lingering twilight that refuses to fade during Michigan summers. The winds had picked up, and the waves were crashing harder against the shore, sending mist into the air, even though we were perched high above. It wasn't unusual for Lake Michigan to get rough at night. We'd camped nearby several times and were used to falling asleep to the sound of wind and waves, a natural white noise that could lull anyone into a deep sleep. I had my old film camera with me, a clunky but reliable piece of equipment with a 200mm zoom lens. It wasn't the most advanced, but it had captured some beautiful moments during our hikes over the years. I remember thinking about how perfect this scene was, how the quiet beauty of nature had a way of making everything else in life feel insignificant. Little did I know, the serenity of that moment was about to be shattered. As we stood at the overlook, chatting and soaking in the last light of the day, something caught my eye. A flash of light, quick and faint, far out over the water between the mainland and the North Manitou Island. At first, I thought nothing of it. Boats frequent this part of the lake, and it wasn't unusual to see a flash from a vessel passing by. But then it flashed again. I squinted, trying to make out what I was seeing. The light seemed to be coming from near the North Manitou Shoal Lighthouse, a crib lighthouse that stands alone in the water. I knew it wasn't manned. Those types of lighthouses had been automated for years. My curiosity piqued. I raised my camera and zoomed in as far as I could, though the 200mm lens struggled to capture anything clearly from such a distance. The wind howled around us as I peered through the viewfinder, trying to focus on the source of the light. My heart started to race a little, though I wasn't sure why. After all, boats weren't uncommon here. But something about the way that light flashed, it wasn't random. It had a pattern. And then it hit me. SOS. I dropped the camera slightly, blinking in disbelief. My fiancé noticed the sudden shift in my expression and asked what was wrong. "I think someone's signaling for help," I said, my voice wavering slightly. Her face mirrored my concern. We weren't close to any boat launches, and the water between us and the islands was vast and treacherous, especially with the high winds and waves we'd been hearing. If someone was out there, they were in serious trouble. We debated for a moment. Could it just be a malfunction? Was it possible that we were misinterpreting the flashes? But deep down, I knew what I had seen. It wasn't a random flicker, it was deliberate. I handed the camera to my fiancée and reached for my flashlight. I flicked it on, pointing it in the direction of the flashes. From several miles away, I knew it was unlikely that anyone could see our light, but it was all we could do at the moment. I waved it back and forth, hoping to make some sort of contact. A wave of adrenaline surged through me. This was real. Someone was out there, fighting against the elements, and we were the only ones who knew. Without thinking, two of us took off running back down the trail, the other couple staying behind to keep watch. The half-mile trek back to the car seemed to stretch on for eternity as we barreled down the hill, dodging trees and roots with only our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Every snap of a twig or rustle of the leaves seemed amplified in the silence of the night. My breath was ragged by the time we reached the car, and with shaking hands we grabbed our cell phones, no smartphones back then, just simple, old-school flip phones. We called the Coast Guard, our voices overlapping as we tried to explain the situation. "There's someone out in the lake," I said breathlessly. "They're flashing SOS from near the North Manitou Shoal Lighthouse. We're at Pyramid Point. You've got to send someone." The Coast Guard assured us they would dispatch a ship to search the area, but the urgency in their voices did little to calm our nerves. "Please hurry," we added before hanging up. With binoculars and phone in hand, we raced back up to the overlook, the trail even steeper on the return. Every muscle in my body burned from the effort, but the thought of that light flashing SOS kept me going. When we returned, the other couple was still there, their faces pale in the dim light. "He's still out there," one of them said, handing me the binoculars. I raised them to my eyes, focusing on the dark water. Sure enough, there he was. Through the shaky lens, I could make out the shape of a small aluminum rowboat, barely staying afloat amidst the waves. The man was rowing furiously, but the wind and water seemed to be pushing him farther away from the shore. Every few minutes, he would turn and flash his light again, sending out the same desperate signal SOS. My stomach twisted in knots as we watched. We were miles away, standing on a cliff, completely helpless. Every time his light flickered in the darkness, it felt like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some distant emergency. This was happening right in front of us, and we couldn't do anything but watch. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The Coast Guard had said they were on their way, but out there on the open water, time seemed to move differently. Every wave that crashed over the boat felt like it might be the last. I could only imagine what the man must have been feeling alone, battling the relentless lake in the pitch black, with no way of knowing if help was coming. I tried to focus on the sound of the waves, the steady crash and retreat of water against the rocks below. But all I could hear was the beating of my own heart, loud and insistent, as if it was trying to drown out the anxiety gnawing at the edges of my mind. The man's light flashed again, weaker this time. "He's not going to make it," I muttered under my breath, barely audible. My fiancée looked at me, her eyes wide with fear and helplessness. There was nothing to say. We continued flashing our light in response. Not that it was doing any good. I knew the man probably couldn't see it if he could see anything at all through the dark and the stormy waves. But it felt like the only connection we had to him. The only thing keeping us tethered to this moment, and to the hope that we weren't just watching a man die. The minutes dragged on. The light flashed once more. And then, nothing. The darkness swallowed the boat whole, leaving us staring at the vast expanse of the lake with no idea what had just happened. Had he capsized? Had he given up? Was he even still alive? We stood there in silence, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on us like the night itself. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw the lights of the Coast Guard ship cutting through the darkness. Relief washed over us, but it was short-lived. The ship began its search, moving in a slow, methodical grid pattern across the water. Its powerful searchlights swept over the waves, illuminating the lake in brief flashes of clarity before plunging it back into darkness. We watched from our perch, our eyes straining to see any sign of the boat or the man. But there was nothing. No movement, no light. Just the endless rise and fall of the waves. The search dragged on, the ship moving steadily from one end of the passage to the other. They were thorough, but the area was vast and the lake was unforgiving. We could only hope that they would find something, anything to indicate that the man had made it. But as the hours ticked by, our hope began to wane. The Coast Guard's lights continued their sweep, but the longer they searched without finding anything, the more certain we became that we had just witnessed a tragedy. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the Coast Guard ship turned and began to move away. They had covered the entire area, but there was no sign of the boat, no sign of the man. He was gone. We stood there for a long time after the Coast Guard left, staring out at the empty lake. There was no closure, no finality. Just the overwhelming sense of helplessness and the haunting image of that flashing SOS growing weaker and weaker until it disappeared altogether. The walk back to the car was silent. None of us knew what to say. We drove into town and stopped at a bar, hoping to hear some news about the search, but there was nothing. The world had moved on, oblivious to the life that had likely been lost out there in the darkness. The next day we called the Coast Guard, desperate for answers, but the person on duty had no information. A shift change had occurred, and no one seemed to know about the call we had made the night before. There was no report, no record of what had happened. To this day, the memory of that night lingers in the back of my mind, unsettling and unresolved. I often wonder what became of the man in the boat if he was found, if he survived, or if he's still out there, lost to the depths of Lake Michigan. The uncertainty is the hardest part. There's no happy or sad ending, just a lingering question mark that haunts me whenever I think back on that night. Sometimes, in the quiet moments when I'm alone, I still see the flashes of light in the distance, and I wonder if somewhere out there, someone is still calling for help, waiting for a rescue that never came. It was the kind of weather that lured hikers into the mountains. The sun, just warm enough to coax you outdoors, with the faintest hint of the impending winter cooling the breeze. My sister, only in her early 20s at the time, and her best friend decided to spend a weekend in the Colorado wilderness. It was supposed to be a simple hike, nothing too intense, an overnight adventure to reach a peak, camp midway, and summit the mountain by morning. They packed lightly. It wasn't supposed to snow, at least not that weekend, so they weren't worried about the cold. My sister, being an experienced hiker, brought all the essentials camping gear, a proper backpack, and her trusty boots. Her friend, less seasoned but eager to join the adventure, had made a critical mistake. She wore a pair of Chaco sandals instead of hiking boots. Not that it seemed like an issue when they started. The trail was dry, and their spirits were high as they began their ascent. As they climbed higher, the trail twisted through pine forests and meadows, the autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet. The further they went, the quieter the world around them became, as if nature itself were holding its breath, waiting for winter's grip to take hold. By the time they reached their camping spot, tucked away in a clearing surrounded by towering trees, it was late afternoon. The sky was starting to shift to softer shades of pink and orange, promising a stunning sunset. They set up their tent, chatting about the next day's plans, and settled in for the night. My sister told me later that they had a perfect evening, one of those rare moments in life when everything feels right. The fire crackled as they shared stories, the wind was calm, and the stars began to peek through the darkening sky. But the serenity was short-lived. Sometime in the dead of night, the weather turned. It started with a drizzle, just a light tapping on the tent's roof. But soon enough, the drizzle grew heavier, the rain began to pour down in torrents, and a biting wind whipped through the trees. My sister awoke with a start, the sudden cold cutting through the thin fabric of the tent like a knife. She sat up, disoriented, as water pooled around their sleeping bags. Her friend was already awake, muttering about the rain and how cold it had gotten. They scrambled to gather their gear, moving things away from the leaking edges of the tent. But no matter how hard they tried to stay dry, the storm outside had turned their camp into a wet, freezing mess. The air was thick with moisture, and the temperature had dropped far faster than either of them had anticipated. When morning finally arrived, they emerged from their tent, shivering and exhausted. The world outside had transformed into something unrecognizable. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soaked, and everything around them was coated in a light dusting of snow. It wasn't deep yet, but it was enough to signal danger. The storm had dragged in freezing temperatures overnight, and now the landscape was cold, wet, and slippery. "We should turn back," my sister suggested, eyeing the trail ahead. Her instincts were kicking in. The summit, which had seemed so close the day before, now felt impossibly far. And with the cold and snow, they were not equipped to go any further. Especially not with her friend wearing only sandals. But her friend was determined. "We've made it this far," she argued, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. "We can still do it. We'll be fine once we start moving again." Against her better judgment, my sister agreed. After all, they'd made it halfway up the mountain, and turning back felt like admitting defeat. They packed up their camp and began the ascent. But it wasn't long before the snow became more than just an inconvenience. The higher they climbed, the deeper the snow became, and the colder the air felt. The sandals, which had been fine on dry trails, were now a dangerous liability, offering no protection from the biting cold. My sister could hear her friend's teeth chattering as they trudged forward. They were about to reach a creek that cut across the trail when they heard something. At first it was faint, almost drowned out by the wind and the crunching of snow underfoot. But then it came again, unmistakable help me. They both stopped in their tracks, looking at each other in confusion. "Did you hear that?" my sister asked. Her friend nodded, her face pale from the cold, her breath coming out in ragged puffs. For a moment they stood still, straining their ears against the wind. There it was again, barely audible, a desperate voice calling from somewhere up the creek. "Help me." They didn't think twice. Without another word, they left the trail and began following the voice, making their way up the creek's edge. The snow had become thicker here, and every step felt heavier as they waded through it, the cold seeping into their bones. As they rounded a bend in the creek, they found her. A woman, lying in the snow, her clothes soaked through and her legs exposed to the elements. She was wearing basic athletic gear leggings, a light pullover jacket, and running shoes completely inadequate for the conditions. Her legs were swollen and discolored, with ugly cuts where the ice had torn through her skin. She wasn't shivering anymore, which was an immediate red flag. Hypothermia had already set in. My sister rushed over, dropping to her knees beside the woman. "How long have you been out here?" she asked, her voice tight with urgency. The woman blinked up at her, confused. "Only a few hours," she mumbled, though her words were slow and slurred, another clear sign that she was far more disoriented than she realized. "I just need to get to the top. That's where my car is parked." My sister's heart sank. "No," she said gently but firmly. "Your car isn't at the top. We need to get you down the mountain." But the woman shook her head weakly. "No, I need to go up. That's where I parked." It was obvious that she wasn't thinking clearly. My sister exchanged a glance with her friend, who was now looking as worried as she felt. They had no cell signal out here, and with the woman in such bad shape, every minute counted. They couldn't afford to wait for help. "We need to move," my sister said, more to herself than to the woman. She looked around, trying to assess the situation. The nearest trailhead was miles away, and with the snow piling up, getting down was going to be even more difficult than coming up. She made a quick decision. "We'll carry her," she said to her friend. "We have to." Together they lifted the woman to her feet, each of them taking an arm to support her. She was barely able to stand, her legs trembling under her weight. Slowly they began the long, treacherous descent down the mountain. The snow didn't make it easy. Every step was a struggle, their feet slipping on the icy trail as they tried to keep the woman upright. Her head lolled to the side occasionally, and they had to stop several times to make sure she was still conscious. The cold was relentless, biting through their clothes and making every movement feel like a monumental effort. As they descended, my sister kept talking to the woman, trying to keep her awake. "What's your name?" she asked. "Katie," the woman replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Katie, you need to stay with us, okay? We're almost there," my sister urged, even though she knew they were still far from safety. Katie nodded weakly, but her eyes were distant, unfocused. My sister could see the telltale signs of hypothermia, the confusion, the drowsiness, the irrational insistence that she needed to keep going up. It was terrifying to watch, knowing that every minute they spent in the cold was another minute closer to losing her. The trail seemed endless. With every step, the snow grew deeper, the wind harsher. But they pushed on, driven by the knowledge that they were the only thing standing between Katie and a slow, cold death. My sister's friend, despite the sandals that were now soaked through and completely impractical for the conditions, didn't complain once. They just kept moving. After what felt like hours, they finally reached a spot where the trail leveled out. The snow wasn't as thick here, and for the first time since they had found Katie, my sister felt a glimmer of hope. But they still had miles to go, and with the sun starting to dip behind the mountains, they were running out of time. "I'm so tired," Katie murmured, her head drooping again. "I know," my sister replied, her voice firm. "But you have to keep going. We're almost there." Eventually, they reached a clearing near the base of the mountain. My sister's friend, who had been quietly struggling with the cold and exhaustion herself, let out a shaky breath. They had made it. Now they just needed to get Katie to her car. The final stretch of the hike felt like a blur. They found Katie's car parked at the trailhead, just as she had said, though she had been too disoriented to remember that she had hiked up the mountain, not driven. By some miracle, my sister was able to start the car, and they bundled Katie into the back seat, wrapping her in blankets to try and keep her warm. But it wasn't enough. My sister knew that hypothermia was a life-threatening condition, and they needed professional help. There was still no cell service, so they drove to the nearest bed and breakfast, where they had rented a room for the night. The owners were an elderly couple, and when my sister explained the situation, they immediately called for a medic. Within minutes, an ambulance was on its way, and they were able to get Katie the medical attention she desperately needed. The paramedics confirmed what my sister had suspected all along. Katie had been out there far longer than just a few hours. Hypothermia had dulled her senses, making her believe she had only just begun to feel the cold. In reality, she had been in grave danger for much longer. Katie was taken to the hospital, where she spent the night recovering. My sister and her friends stayed behind at the bed and breakfast, shaken by the ordeal. They had saved a life that day, but it had taken a toll on them both. The next morning, they visited Katie in the hospital. She was still weak, but she smiled when she saw them. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You saved my life." My sister nodded, too emotional to say much in return. It was a strange feeling, knowing that a simple hike had turned into something so life-altering. They had come to the mountains for adventure, but they had found something far more profound and unbreakable bond formed through survival. Katie and my sister stayed in touch after that, though they never returned to that mountain. The memory of that day, of the snow and the cold and the fight to survive, was enough to last a lifetime. The night had settled in fast quicker than we'd expected, as it often does when you're deep in the woods. We weren't far from our campsite, just a short hike through the dense underbrush, and we'd be back, ready to sit by the fire and call it a night. The air had turned chilly, the kind of sharp cold that creeps up on you the moment the sun dips below the horizon, especially out here in the wilderness. I remember the quiet, the type of quiet that feels too loud, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I was 15, and my friend had convinced me to come on this trip with his family. They were avid campers and hunters, seasoned in the ways of the outdoors in a way that I wasn't. It wasn't my first time camping, but it was definitely the first time I'd felt uneasy. My friend's parents were still at the campsite, and it was just the two of us walking back from the lookout we'd hiked to earlier that day. With no more than 2 flashlights between us and the path ahead growing darker by the second, the forest seemed to close in around us. We weren't talking much anymore, both of us just listening to the sounds around us, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional chirp of crickets, the creaking of old tree branches swaying gently in the wind. It was peaceful, or at least it should have been, but something felt off, like a weight pressing down on my chest. My friend, who had been unusually quiet for the past few minutes, stopped dead in his tracks. "Dude, I think something's following us," he whispered, his voice barely audible but laced with fear. I turned to him, frowning. "What? You're paranoid. It's just the wind." But even as the words left my mouth, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I focused on the darkness behind us, my flashlight beam trembling slightly as I swept it through the trees. Nothing. Just the endless stretch of woods, thick with shadows and the occasional flash of moonlight through the canopy above. "I swear I heard footsteps," he insisted, his eyes darting nervously to the thick brush beside the trail. We started walking again, a little faster this time. I couldn't deny that my heart was beating faster, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerge from the darkness behind us. But the forest remained still, eerily so. And then there it was, faint, but unmistakable. The crunch of footsteps behind us. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. My friend looked at me, his eyes wide. "You heard it, right?" I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. The footsteps stopped as soon as we did, like whoever or whatever was behind us knew we were listening. We stood frozen, our flashlights pointed into the trees, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The beam from my flashlight flickered for a moment, casting long, twisted shadows across the forest floor. For a second, I thought I saw something, a dark shape moving silently between the trees. "Let's go," my friend said, his voice shaking now. He didn't have to tell me twice. We started walking again, faster this time, almost jogging, our footsteps crunching loudly on the gravel path. But the footsteps behind us picked up too, matching our pace. I didn't dare look back again. My entire body was tense, my muscles screaming for me to run, but I didn't want to panic, not yet. We weren't far from the campsite. If we could just get there, we'd be safe. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself. The sound of footsteps was getting closer now, almost too close. Whoever was following us was no longer trying to stay hidden. The footsteps were heavier, deliberate, and they didn't belong to just one person. There were multiple sets of them, growing louder with every step we took. "What the hell is that?" my friend muttered, his flashlight flicking back and forth wildly as we broke into a full sprint. My heart was hammering in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins as we ran. The footsteps behind us turned into a soft patter, like something running on all fours. That's when I heard a low, guttural growl, followed by the unmistakable sound of something rustling through the brush beside us. "Coyotes," my friend shouted, his voice cracking with fear. He'd grown up hunting, so he knew the sounds of the forest better than I did. But even I could recognize the threat now, the sharp, predatory noises surrounding us, cutting through the night air. We didn't stop. There was no time to think, no time to process the terror that was slowly sinking its claws into us. All we could do was run. The camp wasn't far, just through the next thicket of trees and down the hill. Maybe a 5-minute sprint at most. But in that moment, it felt like miles. The sounds behind us were getting louder, closer. I could hear the panting now, the soft whine of hungry animals tracking their prey. My mind raced. I'd read enough about coyotes to know that they usually avoided humans. But this pack, they were bold. Too bold. I didn't want to think about what that meant. My friend slowed down for just a second, fumbling with his backpack as we ran. "What are you doing?" I shouted, panic rising in my voice. "My knife," he said breathlessly, yanking a small hunting knife from his pack. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I reached for my own backpack, only to realize I hadn't brought anything. No knife, no weapon, nothing but a flimsy flashlight. The growling was right behind us now, and I could feel the eyes on us, dozens of them, watching, waiting. Coyotes were opportunists. They wouldn't attack unless they thought they had the upper hand, and right now we were outnumbered. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement, 4 sets of glowing eyes, staring back at us from the brush. The coyotes had fanned out, circling us, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Don't stop," I told my friend, my voice shaking. "Just keep going." But he didn't listen. He skidded to a halt, turning around to face the approaching pack. "We have to make a stand," he said, brandishing the knife in front of him. "If we keep running, they'll chase us down." I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that this was insane, but the fear in his eyes stopped me. He was right. The coyotes weren't going to stop. They were playing with us, herding us into a corner. We stood there, side by side, our backs to the trees, staring out into the darkness. The eyes moved closer, and I could see their outlines now, lean, wiry bodies slipping through the underbrush, their tails low, their ears flat against their heads. There were at least 7 or 8 of them, maybe more. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to run, but I knew that would only make things worse. The coyotes were too close now. One wrong move, and they'd be on us. I held my flashlight high, the beam cutting through the darkness as I swung it back and forth, trying to keep them at bay. My friend raised his knife, his hands shaking but steady enough to show the coyotes we weren't completely helpless. For a moment, everything was still. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath, the coyotes watching us, waiting. It felt like hours passed, though it could have only been seconds. I could hear the soft whine of the wind through the trees, the rustle of dry leaves beneath our feet, the shallow, rapid breaths of the animals surrounding us. Then one of them stepped forward, a large male, its fur matted and scraggly, eyes glowing fiercely in the beam of my flashlight. It growled low, its teeth bared, and my heart sank. This was it. My friend took a step forward, raising his knife higher, his voice trembling but defiant. "Get out of here," he shouted, his voice echoing through the woods. The coyote hesitated, its ears flicking back, but it didn't move. I swung my flashlight at it, trying to make myself look bigger, more threatening. "Go on." "Get," I yelled, my voice cracking slightly. The coyote snarled but didn't advance. The pack stayed in place, watching, waiting for a signal. I knew they were weighing their options, deciding whether or not we were worth the effort. And then, out of nowhere, came the sound that saved us, the sharp crack of a branch breaking in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of voices, human voices. The coyotes froze, their ears perking up, their heads swiveling in the direction of the noise. For a moment, they seemed unsure of what to do, their predatory instincts warring with their natural wariness of humans. "Hey, you boys okay over there?" It was my friend's father, his deep voice booming through the trees. The coyotes didn't wait around. As soon as they realized we weren't alone, they scattered, melting back into the forest like shadows retreating from the light. My knees nearly gave out with relief, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins, leaving me shaky and lightheaded. We stood there, panting, staring at the empty space where the coyotes had been just moments before. I couldn't believe it. We were alive. They had been right there, so close I could have reached out and touched them, and now they were gone. My friend's father appeared moments later, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "What the hell were you boys doing out here?" he asked, his tone a mixture of concern and frustration. "We were just heading back," I muttered, still trying to catch my breath. "We didn't know they were following us." "Well, they're gone now," he said, his face softening as he saw the look of pure fear in our eyes. "Let's get back to camp. You've had enough excitement for one night." We didn't argue. We followed him back to the campsite in silence, too shaken to say much. The fire was still burning when we arrived, casting a warm glow over the small clearing. It felt surreal, as though the danger we had just faced had never even happened. But the memory of those glowing eyes, of the low growls and the feeling of being hunted, lingered in the back of my mind. We didn't talk much about what happened that night, not with the others around. But later, as we lay in our sleeping bags, my friend and I exchanged a few quiet words. "I thought we were done for," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper in the darkness. "Me too," I replied, my heart still racing at the memory. I don't think either of us slept much that night. Even though the coyotes were gone, the feeling of being watched stayed with us. It's a feeling that never quite goes away, not after something like that. And to this day, I can still hear the soft crunch of footsteps behind me whenever I walk through the woods at night. It's a sound I'll never forget. New Year's Eve always carried a sense of excitement. The promise of a fresh start, resolutions ready to be broken, and the thrill of late-night adventures that usually ended with fireworks lighting up the sky. That night, Jane, my girlfriend, and I decided to escape the crowds and head to a secluded spot deep in the woods to watch the fireworks. It was our little tradition, a way to ring in the new year away from the noise, the crowds, and the chaos of the city. We left around 9:30 p.m., just after packing up a few snacks, some water, and essentials like flashlights and a compass. The spot we had picked was about a 15-minute walk into the woods, a clearing we had stumbled upon a few summers back while hiking. Surrounded by trees on all sides, the clearing opened up to a perfect view of the night sky. It was isolated, peaceful, and we had never encountered anyone else there before. That was part of the appeal. The drive out of town was quiet, with most people already gathered in their homes or at parties, celebrating the final hours of the year. As we pulled off the main road and parked by the trailhead, the excitement in Jane's eyes was contagious. We grabbed our gear and set off down the narrow, winding trail that led to the clearing. The woods were dark, the only light coming from the occasional flicker of the moon breaking through the thick canopy above. The air was crisp and cold, biting at our faces, but it was nothing we weren't used to. As we walked, we talked about the past year, its highs and lows, what we wanted to achieve in the next. Jane laughed about how bad we both were at keeping resolutions, her breath puffing out invisible clouds as she spoke. We were in good spirits, our conversation cutting through the silence of the forest. About halfway to the clearing, the trail veered off sharply, leading deeper into the woods. Here the trees seemed to grow closer together, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers above our heads. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting a path through the darkness. I wasn't worried. This wasn't the first time we'd walked this trail at night, and it wasn't the first time we'd heard strange noises in the woods. The forest always had a way of playing tricks on your mind, making you hear things that weren't really there, animals scurrying through the underbrush, branches snapping under their weight, or the wind whistling through the leaves. We reached the clearing a few minutes before 10 p.m., and it was as beautiful and quiet as ever. The sky was clear, a deep, inky black, speckled with stars. The moon, full and bright, hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. We spread out a blanket and sat down, our backs to the woods, facing the open sky. We had a perfect view of the distant town, where we knew the fireworks would soon fill the air. For a while, we just sat there in comfortable silence, watching the stars. Jane leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm around her, feeling the cold air against our skin. It was peaceful. Too peaceful, I would later realize. Out of nowhere, Jane lifted her head and looked towards the woods, her eyes narrowing in confusion. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the night. I frowned and followed her gaze, but all I saw were trees. "See what I asked?" A hint of amusement in my voice. Jane had always been a little jumpy, especially in the dark. She shook her head, her brow furrowing. "I thought I saw something. Someone. Never mind, it's probably just a deer." I smiled and pulled her closer. "It's nothing. Just the woods messing with you." She didn't seem convinced, but let it go. We returned to our quiet, the excitement of the upcoming fireworks keeping our minds busy. But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods around us had grown unnaturally quiet. No wind, no rustling of leaves, nothing. Just an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. Jane tensed beside me, and I felt her grip on my arm tighten. "Shay," she hissed, her voice sharp. "Do you hear that?" I stopped breathing for a moment, straining my ears. At first, I heard nothing but the pounding of my own heart in my ears. Then I heard it, a faint crunch of leaves and snapping twigs somewhere deep in the woods behind us. It was slow, deliberate, like someone trying not to be heard. I sat up straighter, my pulse quickening. "It's probably just an animal," I whispered, though I didn't believe it. The sound was too steady, too purposeful. Whatever it wasn't moving away. It was coming closer. Jane's eyes were wide now, her breath quickening. "Turn off the light," she said suddenly, her voice trembling. "Just turn it off." I did as she asked, flicking off the flashlight and plunging us into darkness. We sat there, frozen, listening to the eerie silence that followed. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the situation. It's nothing, I told myself. Probably a hiker. Or someone trying to find a spot to watch the fireworks. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Another snap of a twig, this one much closer. I turned to Jane, my voice barely a whisper. "We should go." She nodded, and we stood up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. But as we gathered our things, I glanced back towards the woods, and that's when I saw him. A tall figure, silhouetted against the trees, walking towards us with slow, deliberate steps. He was about 50 feet away, his face obscured by the darkness, but the moonlight glinted off something in his hand, a knife, large and menacing, catching the light with every step he took. My heart stopped. "Jane," I whispered urgently, my voice barely audible, "we need to run." She followed my gaze, and when she saw the man, her face drained of color. Without another word, we grabbed what we could and bolted. The man didn't shout, didn't call out to us, he just kept coming, his footsteps quickening as he realized we were running. We sprinted through the woods, the trail ahead barely visible in the darkness. My flashlight bobbed in my hand, the beam flickering across the trees as we ran. Behind us, I could hear him, his footsteps pounding against the forest floor, growing louder, closer. My mind was racing, panic flooding my senses. Who was this guy? Why was he following us? And what the hell was he planning to do with that knife? My lungs burned, my legs screaming in protest as we tore through the underbrush. The trail was uneven, littered with roots and rocks that threatened to trip us at every step. I could hear Jane's breath coming in ragged gasps beside me, but I didn't dare slow down. We couldn't stop. Not now. After what felt like an eternity, we burst out of the woods and onto the dirt road where we had parked the car. Relief surged through me as I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But when we reached the car, my blood turned to ice. All 4 tires had been slashed. Deep gashes in the rubber, rendering the car useless. No, I muttered, my hands trembling as I stared at the ruined tires. This couldn't be happening. We were trapped, stranded, and he was still out there, getting closer by the second. Jane was on the verge of hysteria, her hands clutching at my jacket. What do we do? What the hell do we do? I grabbed her hand and yanked her towards the road. We run. There's got to be someone on this road. We'll flag them down. We sprinted again, this time down the dirt road, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. My heart pounded in my ears, fear driving us forward. Behind us, I heard a noise, a soft, deliberate crunch of gravel. He was still following us. The road was long, stretching out into the darkness with no end in sight. Every step felt like a lifetime, my legs heavy with exhaustion, my lungs burning. But we couldn't stop. Not yet. Just when I thought we wouldn't make it, headlights appeared in the distance. A truck rumbling down the road towards us. Thank God, I gasped, waving my arms frantically as the truck approached. "Help, please." The truck slowed to a stop, and a large man stepped out, his brow furrowed in concern. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice gruff. "There's a man," Jane sobbed, pointing back towards the woods. "He's following us. He has a knife." The man's expression darkened, and without a word, he reached into the back of his truck and pulled out a shotgun. He motioned for us to get into the truck, and we scrambled inside, locking the doors behind us. through the windshield. We watched as the man stood by his truck, scanning the woods. The minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last, but the stranger never appeared. After what felt like hours, the man finally got back into the truck, his shotgun still in hand. "You kids are lucky," he muttered as he drove us down the road, away from the woods, away from the clearing, and away from whatever nightmare we had narrowly escaped. We never did find out who the man was or what he wanted. By the time the police arrived at the clearing the next day, there was no trace of him. Just the slashed tires, the blanket we'd left behind, and the eerie silence of the woods. But we never went back. Not after that. Every New Year's Eve since, when the fireworks light up the sky and the crowds cheer in celebration, I can't help but think about that night. About the man in the woods with the knife. About the feeling of being hunted, of knowing that one wrong move could have cost us our lives. I still don't know what he was planning to do, and I hope I never find out. All I know is that we were lucky. Luckier than I'd ever want to be again. The late afternoon sun had already started its descent, casting long shadows across the Colorado wilderness as we finished the first leg of our hike. It had been one of those golden autumn days where the air was crisp, the sky was an endless blue, and the leaves of the aspens had turned a fiery shade of orange. It was the perfect day for an adventure, and my two friends, Mike and Sarah, were as eager as I was to explore the rugged terrain that stretched out before us. We'd started our hike earlier that morning, following a trail that wound through the hills and forests of Pike National Forest. It was a relatively remote area, far enough from the main roads that we hadn't seen another hiker all day. That was the appeal: complete isolation, just the three of us, surrounded by nature. The plan was to hike to a small, secluded peak where we could camp for the night, watch the stars, and head back down in the morning. By the time the sun began to dip, we were nearing our campsite, a small clearing at the base of the peak, surrounded by towering pines. The temperature had started to drop, and the chill of the mountain air made us all zip up our jackets as we trekked through the thinning trees. Mike was a few steps ahead, scanning the path with his usual nonchalance, while Sarah and I lagged behind, laughing about some inside joke from years ago. The mood was light, carefree until it wasn't. We had just reached the clearing when Sarah suddenly stopped mid-laugh, her face going pale. She stood frozen, her eyes locked on the tree line behind us. I followed her gaze, my heart skipping a beat when I saw what had captured her attention. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A shadow moved slowly among the trees, its lithe, muscular form barely visible through the underbrush. But there was no mistaking the sleek body, the low-slung shoulders, or the long, twitching tail. A mountain lion. It was about 50 yards away, moving silently through the trees, its amber eyes locked on us. The air seemed to grow colder, the wind quieter, as if the entire forest had stilled in anticipation. The mountain lion was watching us, studying us, and the realization sent a shiver down my spine. For a moment, none of us moved. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as we stood there, hearts pounding in our chests, staring at the predator that had appeared out of nowhere. I had heard stories about mountain lions in Colorado, how elusive they were, how they usually kept their distance from humans. But this one had no intention of keeping its distance. "Holy shit," Mike whispered, finally noticing the lion. His voice was tight, barely audible. "Stay calm," I said quietly, though my own voice was shaking. "Don't run. Just stay calm." The words felt ridiculous, given the circumstances. My mind was racing, trying to remember everything I'd ever read or heard about mountain lion encounters. The advice had always been the same: don't run. Running triggers their predatory instinct. stand your ground, make yourself look big, and back away slowly. But saying it and doing it were two very different things. The mountain lion took a step forward, its muscles rippling under its tawny coat, its eyes never leaving us. It was close enough now that I could see the faint outline of its ribs, the way its ears twitched as it listened to the sounds around us. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. "Don't turn your back," I whispered to Sarah and Mike, my voice barely more than a breath. "Keep facing it." We began to back away slowly, our movements stiff and awkward as we tried to maintain eye contact with the predator. Every step felt like a gamble. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and tree roots, and I had to force myself to move slowly, to keep my balance, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. The mountain lion took another step forward, its gaze locked on me now. My mouth went dry. I felt like prey, completely vulnerable and exposed, as if I was standing in a spotlight with nowhere to hide. "Is it following us?" Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Yeah," I muttered, my throat dry. "It's following." I could feel the weight of its stare, the way it moved so gracefully, so quietly, as if it was floating across the forest floor. Mountain lions are known for their patience, for stalking their prey for miles if necessary, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And this one, it was doing just that. We continued backing away, our eyes never leaving the lion. The sun was sinking lower, and the light filtering through the trees was dimming, casting long shadows across the ground. The lion blended seamlessly with the darkening forest, its tawny coat almost invisible in the fading light. It was like a ghost, gliding effortlessly through the underbrush. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. We were miles from any help, no cell service, no weapons, and no chance of outrunning a predator that could cover ground faster than we ever could. I could feel the cold sweat running down my back, the trembling in my hands as I clutched the straps of my backpack. This wasn't like encountering a bear or a pack of coyotes. This was a cat, a perfect predator, designed to kill with stealth and precision. Mike broke the silence. "What do we do?" His voice was barely controlled panic now. "We keep moving," I said, trying to sound confident, though my heart was hammering in my chest. "Slowly. Don't turn your back and don't run. We have to get to the campsite." The mountain lion was still following us, its body low to the ground, its muscles coiled like springs, ready to pounce. I could see its ears twitching, its eyes flicking between us, as if it were calculating the best target. I knew we had to stay together. In a group, we looked bigger, more threatening. Alone, any one of us would be easy prey. My pulse was racing now, and every sense felt heightened: the rustling of leaves, the crunch of our footsteps, the soft hiss of the wind through the trees. Every sound felt like a signal to the mountain lion, a reminder that we were in its territory. As we neared the campsite, the lion stopped. It stood still, just a few yards away, watching us intently, its body tense. My heart raced as I waited for its next move, my legs shaking beneath me. Was it going to pounce? Was this it? But it didn't. Instead, it stared at us for a long moment, its eyes glowing in the fading light. And then, as if deciding we weren't worth the effort, it turned and slinked back into the trees, disappearing into the thick underbrush as silently as it had come. I didn't dare move for a minute, too shocked to even breathe. My legs felt weak, and I could barely process what had just happened. Had we really just been stalked by a mountain lion? And had it really just left? It did. "Did that just happen?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "Yeah," I muttered, still in disbelief. It happened. Mike let out a shaky breath, rubbing a hand across his face. Holy shit, man. That was. Too close, I finished for him, my hands still trembling. We stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where the lion had disappeared, our bodies still tense, as if expecting it to return. But it didn't. The forest was quiet again, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. It felt surreal, like a dream, or more accurately, a nightmare. After a few minutes, we finally moved, heading toward the campsite. My legs were still shaky, and my mind was racing, replaying the encounter over and over in my head. The weight of what had just happened settled in my chest like a heavy stone. We had been lucky, incredibly lucky, and I couldn't help but think about how close we had come to becoming a statistic, another story about a group of hikers who'd encountered a mountain lion and didn't make it back. When we reached the campsite, we didn't speak much. The mood had shifted dramatically, the lighthearted banter from earlier replaced by a heavy, lingering tension. We set up our tents quickly, glancing over our shoulders every few minutes, half expecting to see the lion's glowing eyes staring back at us from the edge of the forest. That night, none of us slept much. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl sent jolts of adrenaline through my veins. My heart would race, my mind imagining the lion creeping back toward our camp, ready to finish what it had started. I lay awake for hours, my body tense and alert, my eyes scanning the darkness outside the tent. The fire we had built earlier had long since died out, leaving the clearing in complete darkness. And in that darkness, every noise felt amplified, every shadow a threat. At some point during the night, I heard it again, the soft padding of paws on the forest floor. I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest as I listened intently. The sound grew closer, circling the camp. I wanted to reach for the flashlight, to get up and check, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Fear held me frozen in place, paralyzed by the thought of what might be out there. Minutes passed, each one dragging on painfully, and then the sound faded. Whatever had been out there was gone. The next morning, we packed up camp in silence. The sun had risen, casting long rays of light through the trees, but it did little to lift the weight of what had happened. None of us wanted to talk about it. We were all too shaken, too exhausted. As we made our way back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. The mountain lion was gone, but the memory of those amber eyes, the way it had stalked us through the forest, would stay with me for a long time. We didn't speak much on the hike back to the car. The adventure we'd been so excited about just the day before now felt like a distant memory, replaced by a lingering sense of unease. The forest, once a place of peace and beauty, now felt hostile, dangerous. When we finally reached the trailhead and piled into the car, we all let out a collective sigh of relief. We were safe, but I knew that for the rest of my life, I would never forget that feeling, the feeling of being watched, of knowing that something was out there waiting. As we drove away, leaving the wilderness behind, I glanced back at the mountains one last time. They loomed over us, their peaks sharp against the sky. And for the first time, I felt a deep respect for the wild, the untamed, unpredictable beauty of it, and the way it could remind you, in an instant, just how small and vulnerable you really are. It was supposed to be a typical summer evening hike, just two best friends, Amy and Sarah, out for a walk to catch the last light of the day. The plan was simple. They'd head to their favorite overlook, watch the sunset, and then make their way back before it got too dark. It was a trail they knew well, winding through a thick forest, with towering pines and the occasional clearing where the underbrush thinned enough to let the light through. The golden hour had set in, casting a warm, hazy glow over everything as they made their way up the path. The air was fresh and crisp, the kind of perfect summer evening that made you forget about everything else. Birds chirped in the trees above, their songs fading into the background as the two friends chatted, laughing and sharing stories about their week. The light-hearted atmosphere made it easy to forget just how isolated they were out here, miles from the nearest road, with nothing but the woods around them. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Sarah stopped mid-sentence, her brow furrowing. She held up her hand, motioning for Amy to stop. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. Amy cocked her head to listen, the sound of their footsteps fading into silence. At first there was nothing but the usual sounds of the forest, the wind rustling the leaves, the distant chirp of crickets. But then, faint and rhythmic, came the unmistakable sound of metal hitting earth. Clang, clang, clang. It was slow and deliberate, echoing through the trees in a way that felt almost too loud, too unnatural for this peaceful setting. Amy glanced at Sarah, her eyes wide with curiosity and a touch of unease. "What is that?" Amy whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah shook her head, her brow furrowed. "I don't know. Sounds like someone's digging." They stood there for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm of the digging. It was coming from just off the trail, maybe 30 or 40 feet ahead, hidden by a dense cluster of trees and underbrush. There was no trail marker nearby, no campsite or sign of activity that they knew of, which made the sound even more strange. Sarah, ever the curious one, nudged Amy. "Let's check it out." Amy hesitated, glancing up at the sky. The sun was already sinking lower, casting long shadows across the trail. They didn't have much time before it would get dark, and the idea of venturing off the trail to investigate some random noise wasn't exactly appealing. But Sarah had already started moving, her curiosity getting the better of her as she crept quietly through the trees. Reluctantly, Amy followed, her heart pounding in her chest as they approached the source of the sound. The digging grew louder, more distinct with every step. She could hear the scrape of the shovel against the dirt now, the grunt of effort as someone worked tirelessly to dig what seemed like a large hole. They reached a small clearing, hidden just out of view of the main trail. And there, at the center of the clearing, was a man. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn-out jeans and a faded jacket, his back to them as he drove the shovel into the earth with slow, deliberate movements. His head was bent low, his face hidden beneath the brim of an old, wide-brimmed hat. Dirt piled up around his feet, forming a growing mound next to what was now a fairly large hole. Amy's breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering in her chest. There was something about the scene that felt wrong. They weren't far from civilization, but the sight of this lone figure, digging in the middle of nowhere with no tools except for a rusty shovel, sent a chill down her spine. Sarah stepped forward, her foot crunching on a twig as she tried to get a better look. The sound was soft, but in the silence of the clearing it seemed impossibly loud. The man froze. For a long moment he stood there, the shovel buried halfway into the dirt. His body was rigid, tense, as if he was listening, waiting for something. Amy grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back slightly, her heart racing. "We should go," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. But before they could move, the man turned. His face was obscured by shadows, but even from a distance, Amy could see the glint of something metallic in his hand. He was holding the shovel in one hand, but the other. It was holding something else. A long, thin object that caught the fading light of the sun as it glinted through the trees. A knife. Life. Amy's stomach dropped. Panic surged through her as she realized that whatever this man was doing, it wasn't good, and now he knew they were there. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The man stared at them, his face unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. His body was still, but his grip tightened on the knife, his knuckles white as he stood frozen in place, watching them. Then, without warning, he moved. It was subtle, just a small step toward them, but it was enough to send Amy's heart into overdrive. She yanked Sarah's arm again, harder this time, her voice urgent. Go. Now. They turned and ran, their feet pounding against the dirt as they sprinted back toward the trail. The branches clawed at their arms, the underbrush snagging on their clothes as they fought their way back through the woods. Behind them, Amy could hear the man moving, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, growing closer with every passing second. Amy's mind raced, her breath coming in short, panic gasps as they tore through the forest. They were still a good 10 minutes from the car, and with the sun sinking lower, the trail was growing darker by the second. She could feel Sarah's hand gripping hers tightly, their shared fear driving them forward as they pushed their bodies to the limit. The sound of footsteps behind them grew louder. Amy didn't dare look back, but she could feel the man gaining on them, the weight of his presence pressing down on her like a physical force. They burst onto the trail, the open space offering little comfort as they continued to run. The world around them blurred, trees, rocks, and shadows blending together in a dizzying rush as they focused solely on escaping. Faster, Sarah gasped, her voice tight with fear. He's right behind us. Amy's legs burned, her muscles screaming for relief. But she didn't slow down. The car was still far ahead, parked at the trailhead just beyond a bend in the path. If they could just make it there, they'd be safe. But the footsteps were getting closer. Out of the corner of her eye, Amy saw a break in the trees, a narrow gap in the underbrush that led off the main trail. Without thinking, she veered toward it, pulling Sarah with her. They crashed through the underbrush, their movements frantic and uncoordinated as they plunged deeper into the woods. The sound of the man's footsteps faltered, his confusion evident as they suddenly disappeared from view. For a moment, there was silence, just the sound of their ragged breathing and the rustle of leaves around them. Amy crouched low, pulling Sarah down with her, her heart pounding in her chest. They huddled together in the shadows, hidden by the thick underbrush, their eyes wide with terror as they listened. The footsteps returned slower this time, cautious. The man was searching for them, his boots crunching on the dirt as he moved through the trees. Amy held her breath, her hand gripping Sarah's so tightly that her knuckles ached. Don't move. Don't make a sound. The man's footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were just a few feet away. Amy could see his shadow moving through the trees, his figure barely visible in the dim light. He stopped, standing still for what felt like an eternity, his head tilted slightly as if listening for them. Amy's pulse thundered in her ears, her entire body trembling with fear. She could feel Sarah shaking beside her, their shared terror almost palpable as they huddled together in the dark. Finally, after what felt like hours, the man moved on. His footsteps faded into the distance, growing fainter with every step until they were nothing more than a distant echo. Amy waited a few moments longer, her breath shallow and uneven as she tried to calm the wild beating of her heart. When she was sure the man was gone, she tugged gently on Sarah's arm, motioning for her to follow. They crept out of the underbrush, their movements slow and cautious as they made their way back to the trail. The woods were eerily silent now, the last rays of sunlight barely filtering through the trees as darkness settled over the forest. "We need to get to the car," Amy whispered, her voice hoarse. Sarah nodded, her face pale with fear. They moved quickly but quietly, their footsteps soft against the dirt as they hurried toward the trailhead. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent fresh waves of panic through them, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. Stop not until they were out of the woods. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the trailhead. The car was there, parked just where they had left it, a beacon of safety in the encroaching darkness. Amy fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely fit them into the lock. She yanked the door open, and they both scrambled inside, slamming the doors behind them. For a moment they just sat there, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, too terrified to even speak. It wasn't until they were halfway down the road, the woods shrinking in the rearview mirror, that they finally let out the breath they'd been holding. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Amy shook her head, her hands still gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I don't know, but I'm never coming back here again." They never did return to that trail, and to this day, neither of them knows what that man was doing, what he was digging, or why he had followed them so relentlessly through the woods. But one thing was certain: they had been lucky. Lucky to have escaped that night, and lucky to have made it out of the woods with their lives. My father doesn't scare easily. Born and raised in Mexico, he grew up riding horses through the Sierra Madre Mountains, navigating the rugged, unforgiving terrain like it was second nature. He had a love for adventure that bordered on reckless, always pushing the boundaries of what was safe, whether it was scaling cliffs or exploring remote trails that few dared to tread. It was his way of connecting with the land, the wilderness, and his own sense of freedom. But there was one ride, one experience, that he rarely talked about, and when he did, it was always in a low, cautious voice, as if speaking too loudly would somehow summon the very thing he had encountered that day. It was the late summer of 1982, and my father was spending a few weeks up in the Sierra Madre, tending to cattle on a friend's ranch. The ranch was nestled deep in the mountains, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forests and steep cliffs that made it feel completely isolated from the rest of the world. The rugged beauty of the place was something my father always spoke about, how the mountains seemed to stretch on forever, with the sky above so clear and blue that it felt like you could fall into it. He had been out riding that afternoon, checking on some cattle that had wandered off into the hills. His horse, a sturdy chestnut mare named Alma, trotted along the narrow trail with ease, her hooves kicking up small clouds of dust as they made their way deeper into the mountains. The sun was high, casting long shadows over the rocky cliffs, and the air was dry, the smell of sagebrush and pine filling the air. As he rode, my father couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything he could put his finger on at first, just a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a heaviness that seemed to hang over the land like a veil. The usual sounds of the mountains, the chirp of birds, the rustle of wind through the trees were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness that made his skin prickle with unease. But he pressed on, dismissing the feeling as paranoia. After all, he'd ridden these trails dozens of times before, and nothing had ever happened. It was just his mind playing tricks on him, he told himself. The mountains were vast and empty, and it was easy to let your imagination run wild when you were alone out there. The trail wound up a steep incline, zigzagging through a forest of tall pines that seemed to close in around him. The shadows grew longer as he rode, the sun dipping lower behind the peaks, casting the forest in an orange, almost surreal glow. Alma's pace slowed as the trail became more difficult, her hooves slipping on the loose gravel that lined the path. It was then, as they crested the ridge, that my father heard it. His name, Carve. The voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it cut through the stillness like a blade. He froze, pulling Alma to a halt, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. The voice had come from somewhere in the trees, just ahead of him, where the shadows were thickest. He strained to listen, his breath caught in his throat. For a moment there was nothing, just the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, the silence of the forest pressing in around him. He could have sworn he'd heard someone call his name clear as day, as if they were standing right next to him. But there was no one. He shook his head, trying to brush off the unease that was creeping over him. He must have imagined it. The mountains had a way of distorting sound, echoing voices and noises in strange ways. Maybe it had been the wind or a distant call from the ranch. He tried to convince himself that it was nothing, but the hairs on the back of his neck were standing on end. Then he heard it again. Carve. The voice was closer this time, more insistent, like someone was calling out to him from the shadows. Alma snorted nervously, her ears flicking back and forth as she shifted beneath him, clearly sensing something was wrong. My father's heart skipped a beat, his grip tightening on the reins. He looked around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, any explanation for the voice. But there was nothing, just the thick pines, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze, casting long shadows over the trail. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. No response. For a long moment, he sat there, frozen, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The silence felt oppressive, almost suffocating, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath, waiting. And then, without warning, Alma reared up, her hooves thrashing wildly in the air. My father barely had time to react before he was thrown from the saddle, hitting the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. He gasped for breath, pain shooting through his ribs as he struggled to sit up. Alma bolted, her hooves pounding against the rocky ground as she tore off down the trail, disappearing into the trees. My father watched helplessly as his horse vanished, the sound of her panicked gallop fading into the distance. He was alone. Panic surged through him as he scrambled to his feet, wincing as a sharp pain shot through his side. He must have bruised a rib when he fell, but there was no time to dwell on it. His horse was gone, and he was miles from the ranch, with no way to get back before dark. His heart raced as he looked around, trying to get his bearings. The trail stretched out behind him, winding its way down the ridge and disappearing into the forest. But ahead of him, the shadows were deeper, darker, and the trees seemed to press in closer, as if they were hiding something just out of sight. And then he heard it again. Carve. The voice was unmistakable this time. It wasn't a trick of the wind or a distant echo. It was clear, deliberate, and it was coming from just beyond the trees ahead of him. He turned, his pulse quickening as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Who was calling his name? How did they know him? He'd been riding this trail for hours, and he hadn't seen a single person. The ranch was miles away, and there were no houses or cabins anywhere near here. The voice came again, softer now, almost coaxing. Carve, come here. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to turn around and head back the way he had come. But something, whether it was curiosity or fear, kept him rooted to the spot. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Chorhei. It was closer now, just beyond the ridge. His skin prickled with fear, but something inside him urged him forward. He took another step, then another, his boots crunching softly on the gravel as he moved toward the sound of the voice. The shadows grew thicker as he approached the edge of the ridge, the trees towering above him like silent sentinels. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached the top of the ridge and stopped, his eyes searching the forest below. There was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the dense underbrush and the tall pines swaying gently in the breeze. And then, without warning, a cold, heavy pressure wrapped around his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. He gasped, his body stiffening as he tried to move, but he couldn't. It felt like an invisible force had latched onto him, pulling him backward, dragging him away from the ridge. The pressure tightened, and my father was thrown to the ground, the wind knocked out of him again. His arms and legs flailed as he tried to grab hold of something, anything, but there was nothing but air. He was being dragged across the forest floor, his body scraping against rocks and roots, as he was pulled away from the ridge and deeper into the trees. Panic surged through him as he tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was tight, his chest heaving as he gasped for breath. He could feel the cold, heavy presence tightening around him, pulling him closer to the dark, thick trees that loomed above. Suddenly, just as quickly as it had started, the pressure released him. He lay there, panting and shaking, his body bruised and aching. The shadows seemed to retreat slightly, the weight of the air around him lifting. He scrambled to his feet, his heart racing as he backed away from the trees, his eyes wide with terror. The forest was silent again, the voice gone. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze and the pounding of his own heartbeat. He didn't wait to see if the voice would return. With a final glance over his shoulder, he turned and ran, his legs trembling beneath him as he bolted down the trail. He didn't stop, didn't look back, even as the shadows seemed to reach for him from the corners of his vision. His breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted toward the clearing, where he had left Alma. He had no idea how long he ran, only that the sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting the forest in a deep, eerie twilight by the time he reached the bottom of the ridge. His chest ached, his ribs burning from the effort, but he didn't stop. The fear driving him was too strong, the terror of what he had experienced too fresh. Finally, as he stumbled into the clearing, he saw her Alma, standing there, her sides heaving with exertion but otherwise unharmed. Relief washed over him as he approached her, his hands shaking as he grabbed her reins. They didn't waste any time. My father mounted Alma in one fluid motion, his hands gripping the reins tightly as he spurred her forward. The mare responded immediately, galloping down the trail as if sensing the urgency of the situation. They rode hard and fast, the trees whipping by in a blur as they made their way back toward the ranch. It wasn't until they were several miles away, the ranch finally in sight, that my father allowed himself to breathe again. The oppressive weight of the forest was gone, replaced by the familiar sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, the clatter of hooves on the dirt road, the distant voices of the ranch hands. But the memory of the voice lingered. To this day, my father still isn't sure what he encountered that afternoon. He never returned to that part of the trail, and he never spoke of it to anyone outside the family. But whenever the Sierra Madre Mountains are mentioned, his face tightens and a shadow crosses his eyes. Some things, he says, are better left alone. There's something about old, abandoned places that pulls at the edges of your curiosity, even when every instinct tells you to stay far away. For us, it was Spike's hut. Nestled deep in the woods, far from any well-trodden path, the dilapidated cabin had been there for as long as anyone could remember. The locals called it Spike's hut, though no one seemed to know exactly who Spike was or why the hut had been built in the first place. It stood alone, surrounded by dense trees and overgrown brush, its roof sagging and its walls covered in creeping vines. For years it had remained a curiosity, a place we all knew about but rarely visited. The stories about the hut were what you'd expect: tales of strange noises, ghostly figures, and lights flickering inside when no one was supposed to be there. It was the kind of place parents warned their kids about, a perfect setting for local legends and campfire tales. Some people claimed it was haunted by the ghost of a cowboy who had been murdered there. Others said it was cursed land, a place where bad things happened to those who stayed too long. Naturally, that made it irresistible. One summer, my cousins and I were spending a few weeks at my grandparents' cabin, about an hour's walk from Spike's hut. We were restless, eager for adventure, and the idea of visiting the hut became the focus of our conversations. We were old enough to want to prove ourselves brave, but young enough that the thought of ghost stories still sent a chill down our spines. It was the perfect combination: dangerous enough to be thrilling, but close enough to home that we felt like we could handle whatever we found. On a hot, muggy afternoon in late July, we set out for Spike's hut. There were 5 of us: my cousins Jack and Will, my younger brother Daniel, and 2 friends from town, Jenny and Sarah. Armed with flashlights, snacks, and a growing sense of excitement, we followed the narrow, overgrown trail that wound through the woods toward the hut. The trees grew taller and denser as we walked, their branches arching overhead to block out the sun, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was thick with humidity, and the buzzing of cicadas droned on endlessly as we made our way deeper into the woods. The trail was barely visible at times, just a faint line of trampled grass and dirt leading us forward. Jack, the oldest and most confident of the group, led the way, his flashlight already out even though it wasn't quite dark yet. The rest of us followed closely, our nerves on edge as the trees closed in around us. "Do you think it's really haunted?" Sarah asked, her voice low as she stepped over a fallen branch. Jack shrugged. "Probably not. It's just an old cabin. But there's always a chance." Jenny, who was the most skeptical of the group, snorted. "Yeah, right. It's just a place that's been abandoned for years. People make up stories because it's creepy." Despite her words, there was an edge to her voice, as if she wasn't entirely sure she believed what she was saying. We all felt it, the unease, the weight of the stories we'd heard over the years. As much as we tried to laugh it off, there was something about the hut that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. We reached the clearing just as the sun was beginning to dip below the treetops, casting the forest in a golden, hazy light. Spike's hut stood before us, silent and still, just as we had imagined it. The roof was partially caved in on one side, and the wooden walls were covered in ivy and moss, the windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring out at us from the gloom. "Well, there it is," Jack said, stopping just at the edge of the clearing. He looked back at us, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Who wants to go inside?" The question hung in the air for a moment, none of us eager to be the first to step forward. The stories we'd heard seemed to come rushing back all at once, the tales of strange lights, of shadows moving in the windows when no one was there. It felt wrong to be there, standing on the threshold of something that didn't quite belong to the world we knew. "Come on," Jack urged, stepping forward. "It's just a cabin. What's the worst that could happen?" He moved toward the door, his footsteps crunching on the overgrown grass. The rest of us hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances before finally following him. There was a strange energy in the air now, a heaviness that seemed to cling to the place, like the weight of 1,000 stories pressing down on us all at once. The front door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly as Jack pushed it open with a loud groan. Inside, the air was musty, thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew. The interior was as dilapidated as the outside. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. Old, rusted tools were piled in one corner, and a thick layer of dust covered every surface. But the most unsettling thing was the feeling. It wasn't just the smell or the decay, it was the sense that we weren't alone. Jenny was the first to step inside after Jack, her eyes wide as she took in the cabin. "See," she said, her voice slightly shaky. "Just an old shack. No ghosts." But even she didn't sound entirely convinced. As we explored the main room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was too still, the silence too heavy. It was as if the whole cabin was holding its breath, waiting. I glanced toward the back of the room, where a narrow hallway led to the rear of the hut. The darkness back there was impenetrable, like a wall of blackness that swallowed the weak light from our flashlights. "Hey, look at this," Jack said, his voice low as he knelt down beside one of the walls. He was pointing to a spot on the floor where a series of old bottles were lined up neatly, almost like they had been placed there intentionally. The bottles were dusty and empty, but they seemed recent, like someone had been there not long ago. "Who would leave these here?" Daniel asked, crouching down next to Jack. He reached out to pick up one of the bottles, but Jack stopped him. "Don't," Jack said sharply. "Just don't touch anything." For a moment, no one spoke. We all just stared at the bottles, a growing sense of unease settling over us like a heavy blanket. It was one thing to explore an old, abandoned hut, but it was another to find signs that someone or something had been there before us, and recently. "We should leave," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. "This place feels wrong." None of us argued. Even Jack, who had been the most eager to explore, seemed uneasy now. We turned to leave, our footsteps echoing in the empty cabin as we made our way back to the door. But as we reached the threshold, a sound stopped us in our tracks. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable, a low, rasping breath coming from somewhere in the darkness behind us. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I turned slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The others turned too, their faces pale in the dim light. The sound came again, louder this time, like the ragged breathing of someone or something just out of sight. "What the hell was that?" Jenny whispered, her voice trembling. None of us answered. We were too scared to move, too terrified to even breathe. The sound continued, slow and rhythmic, like the steady rise and fall of a sleeper's breath. It was coming from the back of the hut, from the hallway that led into the impenetrable darkness. Jack took a step forward, his flashlight aimed at the hallway. "Hello," he called out, his voice wavering slightly. "Is someone there?" No response. For a long moment we stood there, frozen, our eyes locked on the blackness beyond the hallway. The breath continued, slow and steady, but we couldn't see anything, no movement, no shadows, nothing to explain the sound. "Let's get out of here," Daniel muttered, his voice barely audible. We turned to leave again, our fear now a palpable thing, pressing down on us with every step. But before we could make it to the door, the sound changed. The breathing quickened, became more labored, almost frantic, as if whoever or whatever was in that hallway was struggling to breathe. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, like the air had been sucked out of the room. My heart pounded in my ears as we stood there, waiting, listening. I wanted to run, to bolt out of the cabin and never look back, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the floor. Suddenly, a shadow moved. It was quick, almost too fast to see, but it was there just at the edge of our vision, a dark shape darting across the hallway. Disappearing into the shadows. My stomach dropped. I wasn't imagining it. None of us were. There was something in the hut with us, something that didn't want us there. Go, Jack shouted, his voice breaking the spell. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted out of the cabin, our footsteps pounding against the floorboards as we fled into the clearing. The air outside felt cold and sharp compared to the heavy, oppressive atmosphere inside the hut, but even the open space didn't feel safe. We ran without looking back, our flashlights bobbing wildly as we sprinted down the trail. The trees blurred around us, their branches clawing at our arms and faces as we pushed through the underbrush, desperate to get as far away from Spike's hut as possible. It wasn't until we reached the safety of my grandparents' cabin that we finally stopped, gasping for breath, our hearts racing. We collapsed onto the porch, our bodies shaking with adrenaline and fear. For a long time, none of us spoke. We just sat there, staring into the darkness of the woods, waiting for anything to appear. But the forest was still quiet, as if nothing had happened. Did you see it, Jenny finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. We all nodded. There was no point in denying it. We had all seen the shadow, heard the breathing. Something was in that hut, something we couldn't explain. None of us ever went back to Spike's hut after that. It became a story we told only when pressed, a strange, unsettling memory that lingered in the back of our minds. Whatever we had encountered in that hut, whether it was a ghost, a shadow, or something else entirely, wasn't something we wanted to experience again. And to this day, the hut still stands, hidden deep in the woods, waiting for the next group of curious adventurers to stumble across its threshold. But I doubt they'll stay long. It was a typical late afternoon in early summer when I decided to take my usual hike down to the creek. I had been coming to this trail for years, a serene, quiet path just outside of town, winding through the thick woods and down to a wide, slow-moving creek. It was my refuge, a place where I could unwind, collect my thoughts, and escape the constant hum of daily life. That day, the weather was perfect. The sky was a soft, muted blue with wisps of clouds hanging lazily overhead, and the air was warm but not stifling. The woods smelled fresh, like damp earth and pine needles, the aftermath of a recent rainstorm. I had no particular agenda other than to sit by the creek, maybe wade into the water, and enjoy the quiet. The trail to the creek was familiar, one I could navigate with my eyes closed. It was narrow, with tree roots crisscrossing the dirt, a little rocky in places, but generally an easy walk. I usually encountered a hiker or two on my way down, but today the trail seemed completely deserted, adding to the tranquility of the moment. When I reached the creek, the water was higher than usual, no doubt from the rain, and the current moved a little faster than its typical lazy pace. The water reflected the sky, a silvery blue surface that rippled occasionally as a leaf or twig floated downstream. I found my favorite spot, a large, smooth boulder that jutted out just over the edge of the water, and sat down, letting my legs dangle off the side. I had been sitting there for maybe 15 minutes, enjoying the peace, when I heard a splash. It was a subtle sound at first, barely enough to break my attention, but then I heard it again, this time louder. I turned my head, my eyes scanning the creek for the source. At first, I didn't see anything. The creek flowed steadily, unperturbed, and there were no animals nearby that could have caused the sound. I was about to dismiss it when I noticed movement in the water, just upstream. A figure of man was standing in the creek. He was maybe 50 yards away, standing chest deep in the water, his back to me. His clothes were odd, out of place for someone out in the woods. He wasn't wearing the typical hiking gear, no boots, no backpack. Instead, he had on what looked like dark pants and a long-sleeved shirt, both soaked through from the water. His hair was matted to his head, and he seemed to be moving very slowly, like he was searching for something beneath the surface. I watched him for a moment, half expecting him to notice me, to wave or at least look my way. But he didn't. He just continued moving his hands through the water, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were trying to retrieve something. The whole scene felt strange, unsettling even. I'd never seen anyone else wading in the creek like this, especially not someone dressed like that. "Hey," I called out, not really sure why. Maybe I thought he needed help, or maybe I was just trying to break the eerie silence. The man didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. It was as if he hadn't heard me at all. I stood up, a knot forming in my stomach. Something about this situation didn't feel right. The woods had gone unnervingly quiet around me, the usual sound of birds and insects completely absent. The only sound was the soft rushing of the creek and the occasional splash as the man continued his strange movements. I called out again, louder this time. "Hey, are you all right?" Still nothing. The man's head remained bent forward, his attention solely on the water. I debated with myself for a few seconds. Part of me wanted to leave, to just turn around and walk back up the trail and forget I had ever seen him. But another part of me, the part that couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong, urged me to go closer, to see if this man was in some kind of trouble. I hesitated, then stepped down from the boulder and made my way along the creek bank, moving cautiously toward the man. The rocks were slick from the rain, and I had to be careful not to slip. As I got closer, I noticed more details about him. His clothes were definitely old, worn, frayed at the edges, as though they'd been through years of wear. And he was thin, almost gaunt, his shoulders slumped and his back hunched like he was carrying some invisible weight. When I was about 20 yards away, the man suddenly stopped. He froze mid-motion, his hands still submerged in the water, his head tilted slightly as though he were listening for something. "Hey," I called again, my voice now edged with concern. "Do you need help?" This time he reacted. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his head and turned to face me. My blood ran cold. The man's face was pale, almost gray, with dark circles under his eyes that gave him a hollow, sunken appearance. His wet hair clung to his forehead in clumps, and his lips were pressed into a thin, tight line. But it was his eyes that unnerved me the most. They were wide, staring, and they locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I was sure he could hear it. I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came out. I was frozen, rooted to the spot by the sheer wrongness of the situation. Then, slowly, a smile spread across the man's face. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a thin, crooked grin that didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile you see in nightmares, the kind that sends a shiver down your spine and makes your stomach twist in knots. I took an involuntary step back, my pulse racing. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, to get as far away from this man as possible. But my legs felt heavy, like they were glued to the ground. The man continued to stare at me, his grin widening, and then, Without warning, he sank beneath the water. 1 second he was there, standing in the creek, and the next, he was gone, completely submerged in the dark, murky water. There wasn't even a splash. He just disappeared. For a few seconds, I stood there, dumbfounded, staring at the spot where he had been. I expected him to resurface, to pop up and laugh or shout something, but the water remained still, undisturbed. The man had vanished, as though he had never been there at all. I waited, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized he wasn't coming back. The water was calm, flowing gently downstream as if nothing had happened. A wave of nausea rolled over me. What the hell had I just seen? My legs finally found the strength to move, and I stumbled backward, almost tripping over the rocks as I hurried to get away from the creek. My heart was racing, my hands trembling as I turned and started running back up the trail, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running until I reached the parking lot at the trailhead, my lungs burning and my legs feeling like jelly. I leaned against my car, gasping for breath, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Who was that man? How had he disappeared like that? And why had he smiled at me like that? For days after the encounter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I kept replaying the scene in my head, trying to make sense of it, but nothing added up. It wasn't just the man's strange behavior that bothered me, it was the fact that he had vanished so completely, without a trace. I even went back to the creek a few days later, hoping to find some sign of him, something that could explain what I had seen. But the creek was as quiet and peaceful as ever, the water flowing steadily as though nothing had happened. There were no footprints, no disturbed rocks, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there at all. It was as if the man had never existed. I tried to tell myself that maybe he had just slipped underwater and swum away, that maybe I had overreacted. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I had seen the way he looked at me, the way he smiled. There was something unnatural about it, something that didn't belong in this world. As time passed, I stopped going to the creek. I couldn't bring myself to walk that trail anymore, not after what I had seen. The memory of the man, his pale, gaunt face, his unsettling grin haunted me for months. Even now, years later, I still think about him sometimes, especially when I'm near water. I wonder who or what he really was. And I wonder if somewhere out there, he's still standing in that creek, waiting for the next unsuspecting hiker to come along. But one thing is certain, I'll never go back to that creek. Not ever. I had always loved the mountains. Something about the towering peaks, the crisp air, and the vast expanse of wilderness made me feel like I could breathe easier. The world was simpler up there, quieter, more peaceful. That's why I decided to spend the weekend hiking solo in the remote highlands of a national park. It was a bit of a drive, but I didn't mind. I wanted to be alone, to leave behind the daily grind and just lose myself in the serenity of nature. The trail I chose was relatively unknown, not marked on the official park maps. I had found it on an old forum for experienced hikers who sought solitude and adventure. It was challenging but rewarding, and most importantly, far from the crowds that typically populated more popular trails. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon. The sun was already low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the mountains. There were no other cars in the small gravel lot, which was exactly what I had hoped for. I grabbed my pack, double-checked my gear, and set out, eager to reach a good spot to camp before nightfall. The trail was tough, just as I expected, winding through dense forests and steep inclines. I hiked steadily for a few hours, watching the sun dip lower behind the mountain peaks. until I reached a small plateau with a stunning view of the valley below. It was the perfect spot to set up camp, isolated, quiet, and with an incredible vantage point to watch the sunset. I set up my tent quickly, the fading light signaling the fast approaching night. Once my camp was ready, I sat on a rock near the edge of the plateau, sipping water and taking in the breathtaking view. The sun had nearly disappeared, leaving the sky streaked with brilliant colors, deep oranges, purples, and pinks. The air was cool and fresh, and for the first time in what felt like months, I felt at peace. As the stars began to twinkle above, I lit a small fire, its warm glow illuminating the rocky ground around me. I wasn't planning on staying up too late. I had an early start planned for the next day to explore more of the rugged terrain. But for now, I was content just sitting by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the quiet sounds of the forest. That's when I noticed the lights. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable against the backdrop of the darkening sky. Just a few small, flickering pinpricks of light, far off in the distance, at the base of the mountain. I squinted, leaning forward to get a better look, but they were so far away that I couldn't make out much detail. Maybe they were from a distant town, or from other hikers far below. The lights blinked and shimmered in a way that was almost hypnotic. I shrugged it off, figuring it was nothing unusual, and returned my attention to the fire. But as the minutes passed, the lights began to move. I froze, watching as the faint glimmers of light slowly shifted, moving in a deliberate pattern. They weren't stationary anymore. They were rising, climbing the mountain, making their way toward me. My first thought was that they were other hikers, maybe with headlamps or flashlights, making their way up the same trail I had taken. But something about the way the lights moved didn't seem right. They were too smooth, too fluid, like they were floating rather than bouncing with the rhythm of walking. A knot of unease began to form in my stomach. I stood up, walking closer to the edge of the plateau, my eyes fixed on the lights as they continued their steady ascent. There were more of them now, at least 5 or 6, flickering softly in the distance, getting closer by the minute. I glanced down the trail, half expecting to see other campers or hikers emerging from the trees. But the path behind me was empty, and the forest was eerily silent. No footsteps, no voices. Just the soft crackle of my fire and the distant hum of the wind. The lights kept climbing. I grabbed my flashlight from my pack and flicked it on, shining the beam down the trail. The powerful light cut through the darkness, illuminating the rocky path below, but there was nothing. No movement, no hikers, just the empty trail stretching down into the darkness. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. Something wasn't right. These weren't other hikers. I could feel it in my gut. I stood there for a few more moments, staring at the lights as they continued to rise, now less than a mile away. They were moving faster now, too fast for anyone on foot. And they were too high in the air, floating above the ground, weaving through the trees, as if they weren't bound by the laws of gravity. Panic began to creep in, my mind racing with possibilities. Were they drones? But why would anyone be flying drones out here, in the middle of the night, so far from civilization? I turned off my flashlight and backed away from the edge, my heart pounding in my chest. The fire crackled behind me, but its warmth no longer felt comforting. I couldn't take my eyes off the lights. They were getting closer. How much closer? Within minutes, they were only a few hundred feet away, just beyond the tree line that bordered the plateau. I could see them clearly now, 6 or 7 pale orbs of light, floating silently through the trees. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before, hovering effortlessly, their glow faint but steady. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The lights stopped. They hovered just at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 feet away, flickering softly like fireflies. But these weren't fireflies. They were too large, too deliberate in their movements. They didn't blink or dart around randomly. They just waited. I stood frozen, staring at the lights, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. I had no explanation, no logical reason for why these lights were here or what they were. I thought about calling out, shouting into the darkness to see if there was anyone behind the lights, some person controlling them, playing a prank, anything. But the fear kept my mouth shut. My instincts were screaming at me to stay silent, to stay still. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights began to move again. But this time, they weren't moving up the mountain. They were moving toward me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a rock. The lights floated forward, slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between us. My mind raced, searching for some kind of plan, some way to escape, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed with fear. The lights were only 20 feet away now, their glow casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, my skin prickling with a strange, electric sensation. I backed up further, my hands trembling, until I felt the heat of the fire at my back. The flames flickered weakly, as if they were being smothered by the presence of the lights. 15 feet. 10 feet. They were almost on top of me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, just as they reached the edge of the clearing, the lights stopped. They hovered there, silent and motionless, their soft glow illuminating the rocks and trees around me. I could see them clearly now, perfectly round orbs of light, each one about the size of a basketball, floating in midair without any visible source or origin. They didn't move. They didn't flicker. They just watched. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the lights, my heart pounding in my chest. Time seemed to stretch out, the world narrowing down to just me and these strange, impossible orbs. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the lights began to fade. One by one, they dimmed, their glow flickering softly before winking out of existence. Within seconds, they were gone, leaving nothing but darkness in their wake. I stood there, breathless, staring at the spot where the lights had been, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The forest was silent again, the only sound the soft crackle of the dying fire behind me. I waited, half expecting the lights to return, to reappear from the shadows and resume their slow, deliberate approach. But they didn't. The darkness remained still and empty. After what felt like hours, I finally moved. I stumbled back to my tent, my hands shaking as I unzipped the flap and crawled inside. My heart was still racing, my mind spinning with 1,000 unanswered questions. I lay there, curled up in my sleeping bag, listening to the silence outside, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The night passed in a blur of fear and sleeplessness. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of terror through me, but the lights never returned. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I packed up my camp in record time. I didn't bother with breakfast or taking in the view. I just grabbed my gear, threw it into my pack, and hiked down the mountain as fast as I could. I never told anyone about the lights. What could I say? That I had been visited by floating orbs of light in the middle of the night, miles from civilization. No one would believe me. Hell, I wasn't even sure if I believed it myself. But I know what I saw. And I haven't been back to that mountain since. Camping had always been my way of clearing my head. The woods were my escape from the chaos of everyday life. No emails, no phone calls, just me and the quiet serenity of nature. I usually went with a friend or two, but this time I was alone. It had been a rough few weeks at work, and I needed the solitude to regroup. I had planned a solo weekend trip to a remote spot I had visited a few times before, about 5 miles from the nearest trailhead. It was isolated, quiet, and the perfect place to be alone with my thoughts. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, parked my car, and started the hike. The trail was narrow and wound its way through thick woods, with the occasional break in the trees offering glimpses of the mountains in the distance. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. It felt good to be back in nature, away from the constant noise of the city. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. I quickly set up my tent and gathered some firewood, eager to get a fire going before nightfall. The campsite was perfect, completely secluded, with a small stream nearby and a thick wall of trees surrounding the clearing. As the fire crackled to life, I sat back on a log, sipping water from my canteen and letting the warmth of the flames seep into my skin. The sky above had turned a deep purple, the first stars beginning to twinkle against the fading light. Everything was calm. Everything felt right. But then, as the darkness began to settle in, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It wasn't immediate. At first, it was just a vague unease, a feeling that something was off. I glanced around the clearing, but there was nothing, just the trees standing tall and still, their shadows stretching long across the forest floor. I told myself I was being paranoid. It wasn't unusual to feel a little on edge when you were camping alone, especially as night fell. The isolation played tricks on your mind. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. I poked at the fire, trying to shake off the sense of unease. But every time I looked into the trees, I felt like I was missing something. Like there was someone just out of sight, hiding in the shadows, watching me. I told myself it was nothing. There was no one out here but me. But that didn't stop the prickling feeling at the back of my neck, the constant sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. It wasn't until I heard the snap of a twig that my heart leapt into my throat. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as the sound echoed through the quiet night. It had come from just beyond the edge of the clearing, from the thick cluster of trees directly in front of me. I strained my ears, listening, but the forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no animals moving through the brush. Just the soft crackle of the fire and the thudding of my own heartbeat in my ears. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely louder than a whisper. No answer. Just the stillness of the night. I stood up slowly, grabbing my flashlight from my pack, my eyes fixed on the spot where I had heard the sound. My hands were shaking slightly as I flicked the flashlight on, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the trees. Nothing. I swept the light back and forth, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, but the forest was empty. No figure hiding in the shadows, no animal darting between the trees, just nothing. I let out a slow breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was just a deer or a raccoon, something moving through the brush. Nothing to worry about. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I sat back down by the fire, my body tense, my ears straining to pick up any other sounds. The forest was unnervingly quiet now, the usual night sounds of the woods absent. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. As the minutes ticked by, I began to relax just a little. I hadn't heard anything else, and the figure I had been imagining in the trees hadn't appeared. I told myself I was being silly, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, just as I was beginning to settle back into my seat, I saw it. At the very edge of the firelight, just beyond the reach of the flames, a figure stood, motionless. My breath caught in my throat, and I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the figure didn't move. It was tall, at least 6 feet, and shrouded in shadow. I couldn't make out any features, but it was unmistakably human, standing just outside the clearing, watching me. I froze, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts at once. Who was this? How had they gotten so close without me noticing? And why were they just standing there? "Hello," I called out again, my voice trembling. No response. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, as still as the trees around it. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stood up slowly, my hand gripping the flashlight. I flicked it on and aimed it directly at the figure, the beam cutting through the darkness. But when the light hit the spot where the figure had been, it was gone. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the tree line. The figure had vanished, disappeared without a sound. One moment it had been there, and the next it was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes darting back and forth, searching the trees for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No sound, no rustling leaves, no footsteps. Just the empty forest and the faint crackle of the fire behind me. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? Was my brain playing tricks on me? It didn't seem possible. I had seen it. I had felt that something, had been standing there. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my racing heart. There was no way I was imagining this. I had seen something, but what? I slowly backed up to the fire, my eyes never leaving the tree line, and sat down, my flashlight still clutched tightly in my hand. My body was tense, every muscle on edge, waiting for the figure to return. But it didn't. For hours I sat there, staring into the darkness, the fire slowly dying down to embers. The figure never reappeared, and the forest remained eerily silent. Eventually, exhaustion began to creep in. My body was drained from the tension, and my eyes grew heavy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that whatever had been standing at the edge of the clearing was still out there, waiting. I glanced at my tent, debating whether I should try to sleep. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, to hike back to the car in the dead of night and forget this trip had ever happened. But another part of me, the rational part, told me to stay. It was probably nothing. Maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe my mind, tired from the stress of the last few weeks, was playing tricks on me. I finally decided to crawl into my tent, though I kept the flashlight beside me, my hand resting on it, just in case. I zipped the tent flap tightly shut and lay there, my eyes wide open, listening to the silence outside. Hours passed. The fire died completely, leaving the clearing in total darkness. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees, and the occasional hoot of an owl broke the stillness. But there were no more footsteps. No more figures at the edge of the camp. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I woke up to the first light of dawn filtering through the tent fabric. My body ached from the tension of the night before. and my mind was still fuzzy from lack of sleep. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes and glancing around the tent. Everything was where I had left it: my pack, my gear, the flashlight. Everything was normal. But as I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, a wave of unease washed over me. The clearing looked the same as it had the night before, except for one thing. At the edge of the clearing, where the figure had been standing, there were footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the soft earth, but they were there, clear, unmistakable footprints leading into the woods. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Someone had been there. I hadn't imagined it. I quickly packed up my gear, my hands shaking as I stuffed everything into my backpack. I didn't care about breakfast or enjoying the sunrise. I just wanted to get out of there. As I hiked back to the trailhead, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure. Who or what had been watching me? Why hadn't they approached or said anything? And why had they disappeared without a trace, only to leave those footprints behind? By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat, my heart still racing. I threw my pack into the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. I haven't been back to that campsite since. I don't know who or what was out there that night, watching me from the edge of the camp. But I do know one thing: I wasn't alone. And whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. I had always found peace in the woods, something about the isolation, the silence, and the soft whisper of the wind through the trees had a calming effect on me. So after a particularly grueling month at work, I decided to take a solo camping trip. I didn't want to deal with crowded campgrounds or noisy tourists. I wanted true solitude. So I picked a remote spot in the mountains, far off the beaten path, miles from the nearest road. The drive to the trailhead took most of the day, but I didn't mind. The winding roads through the mountains were beautiful, and as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the landscape, I felt my stress melt away. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon, and I was eager to get started on the hike. I grabbed my gear, locked the car, and set off into the woods. The trail was narrow, barely more than a faint path through the trees, but I had a map and knew the area well enough. The campsite I had in mind was about 2 hours in a small clearing by a creek, surrounded by towering pines. I'd camped there once before, years ago, and remembered it being the perfect spot for a quiet, peaceful night under the stars. The hike was uneventful, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. As I walked, the sun continued to sink lower, the light filtering through the trees in long golden beams. It was the kind of peaceful setting I had been craving, and by the time I reached the clearing, I felt like I had left the stress of the world behind. The campsite looked exactly as I remembered it: an open space surrounded by dense forest, with a small stream trickling nearby. I set up my tent quickly, eager to relax before it got dark. Once the tent was up, I gathered some firewood and got a small fire going, the warmth of the flames pushing back the growing chill in the air. I sat by the fire, eating a simple dinner and watching the last light of the day fade from the sky. The stars began to twinkle overhead, and the forest grew darker, the trees looming tall and still around me. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft murmur of the creek. But as the night wore on, a strange feeling began to creep in. It was subtle at first, a vague unease, like something was just off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the longer I sat there staring into the fire, the more the feeling grew. The woods around me, which had felt peaceful and serene only moments ago, now felt oppressive. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more intense. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I had been looking forward to this solitude for weeks, of course. I wasn't used to it. But as I stared into the fire, that uneasy feeling continued to grow, settling like a weight in my chest. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. At first I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the creek. But as I sat there, listening, the sound grew louder. It was a rhythmic thumping, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. I froze, straining to hear. The sound was faint, distant, but it was definitely there. A steady, deliberate thump, like something or someone was moving through the trees. It didn't sound like an animal. It was too slow, too heavy. My heart began to race as I tried to pinpoint the source of the noise, but the forest was too thick, too dark. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight from my pack, and shone the beam into the woods. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but there was nothing. Just the thick trunks and tangled branches, stretching out into the shadows. But the sound continued. Thump. Thump. It was closer now, still distant, but unmistakable. The rhythmic pounding echoed through the still night air, sending a shiver down my spine. I swept the flashlight back and forth, scanning the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. Just the steady thump, 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 like something large and heavy was making its way through the woods. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just an echo, or a tree falling somewhere in the distance. But the sound was too steady, too deliberate. It wasn't random. It was moving. Closer. I backed up toward the fire, my eyes fixed on the tree line, every muscle in my body tense. The flashlight beam flickered slightly, the batteries beginning to wear down, but I didn't turn it off. I couldn't. The sound was getting louder, closer, and I needed to see what was coming. Thump. 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 It was coming from the left now, just beyond the edge of the clearing. My heart pounded in my chest as I shone the flashlight toward the sound, but the trees were so thick I couldn't see anything beyond the first few rows of trunks. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Silence. I stood there, frozen, the flashlight shaking in my hand, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The forest was completely still again, the only sound the faint crackle of the fire and the distant murmur of the creek. The rhythmic pounding was gone, as if it had never been there. But I knew what I had heard, something someone had been moving through the woods. I waited listening, my ears straining for any sign of the sound returning. But there was nothing, just the silence of the night. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly lowered the flashlight and sat back down by the fire, my heart still racing. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I had been hearing things, maybe the isolation was getting to me. It had been a long hike, and I was tired. That had to be it. But as I sat there staring into the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, hiding in the trees, watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat by the fire until the flames died down to embers, my eyes constantly darting to the edge of the clearing, scanning for any sign of movement. The rhythmic thumping didn't return, but the feeling of being watched never left. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I crawled into my tent, zipping the flap tightly shut. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to the silence outside, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sending a jolt of fear through me. But the night passed without incident, and when the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, blinking in the early morning light. The clearing looked the same as it had the night before, the fire reduced to ashes, the creek still babbling softly nearby. Everything was normal, peaceful. But as I packed up my gear, ready to head back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching, waiting. The hike back to the car was uneventful. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the forest felt alive again. The unease I had felt during the night began to fade, replaced by the familiar comfort of being outdoors. By the time I reached the car, I had almost convinced myself that the whole thing had been a product of my overactive imagination. But as I loaded my gear into the trunk and prepared to leave, I heard it again. That sound. Thump. 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 It was distant, faint, barely audible over the sound of the wind in the trees. But it was there. I stood still, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound didn't get any closer this time, didn't move toward me. It just lingered, faint, rhythmic. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I climbed into the car, slammed the door shut, and drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The sound faded as I sped down the gravel road, but the unease remained. I haven't been back to that campsite since. I don't know what caused that sound, and I'm not sure I want to know. All I know is that something was out there moving through the woods, watching me. And the next time I camp alone, I'll make sure it's nowhere near that place. The old cabin had been a family secret for as long as I could remember. My grandfather had built it decades ago, deep in the woods of the Pacific Northwest, far from any towns or roads. It wasn't listed on any maps, and the only way to get there was by hiking miles through dense forest. Growing up, my family would visit the cabin for long weekends or summer breaks, but as the years went on and life got busier, the trips became less frequent. By the time I was in my 20s, the cabin had been mostly forgotten. My parents hadn't mentioned it in years, and I had almost forgotten about it myself until I found the old key in my grandfather's belongings after he passed away. Holding that key, I felt an odd pull to visit the place again. It had been years since I had last seen the cabin, and the thought of spending a few quiet days in the woods sounded appealing. Life had been stressful lately, and I needed the escape. So I packed my gear, grabbed a map from an old hiking guide my grandfather had written, and set off to find the cabin. The drive took most of the day, winding through the mountains on roads that grew narrower and more rugged the further I went. By the time I parked at the edge of the forest, it was late afternoon, the sun already beginning to sink behind the treetops. I grabbed my pack and the old key, locked the car, and started the long hike to the cabin. The trail was overgrown, barely recognizable in some places, but I managed to follow the route my grandfather had marked on the map. The forest was dense and quiet, the trees towering overhead and blocking most of the sunlight. I hadn't seen another person in hours, and I didn't expect this was one of the most remote parts of the state, miles from any towns or hiking trails. That was part of the cabin's appeal. It was a place where you could truly be alone. As I walked, memories of the cabin came flooding back. Summer afternoons spent fishing in the nearby creek, evenings by the fire with my family, and the comforting smell of pine that always seemed to linger in the air. I hadn't been back in nearly a decade, but it all felt familiar, like stepping into a forgotten chapter of my life. After about 2 hours of hiking, I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood. It looked just as I remembered it, small, rustic, with a weathered wood exterior and a stone chimney that rose high above the roof. The windows were dark, the front door slightly crooked, but otherwise the cabin looked untouched by time. I walked up to the door and inserted the old key into the lock. It turned with a soft click, and I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. The inside was just as I remembered, simple but cozy, with a small kitchen, a living area with a stone fireplace, and a loft where the beds were. Dust covered most of the surfaces, and the air smelled stale, but otherwise the cabin seemed perfectly preserved. I spent the next hour unpacking my gear and cleaning up a bit, wiping down the counters and sweeping the floor. Once everything was settled, I lit a fire in the fireplace and sat back, enjoying the warmth and the comforting crackle of the flames. The sun had set by now, and the cabin was bathed in the soft glow of the firelight. It was exactly what I needed: quiet, peaceful, and completely isolated. But as the night wore on, a strange feeling began to settle over me. At first, it was just a vague sense of unease, like the cabin was too quiet. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, I hadn't been here in years, and it was my first time staying alone. The isolation was bound to make me feel a little jumpy. I ate a quick dinner and settled into one of the old armchairs by the fire, listening to the wind howling softly outside. The cabin creaked occasionally, the wood groaning as the temperature dropped, but otherwise the night was silent. But then I heard it. A soft thud from somewhere outside the cabin. I froze, listening intently, my heart starting to race. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees, but the thud had been distinct, different from the natural sounds of the forest. I stood up slowly, glancing toward the front door. The cabin had no electricity, and I had only the fire and a few old lanterns for light. The windows were dark, reflecting the dim glow of the fire inside, but I couldn't see anything beyond them. Another thud. This time it was louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from the side of the cabin, maybe near the back door. I grabbed one of the lanterns and lit it, the small flame flickering weakly in the darkness. My hand shook slightly as I lifted the lantern and walked toward the back of the cabin, the wooden floorboards creaking under my feet. The back door was closed, just as I had left it, but as I approached, I heard another sound, a soft, scraping noise, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling. I opened the door and stepped outside, holding the lantern up to illuminate the area around me. Nothing. Nothing. The wind howled through the trees and the dark forest loomed all around, but there was no sign of anything unusual. No animals, no tracks, just the cold, empty night. I stood there for a moment, my breath visible in the chill air, straining to hear any other sounds. But the thudding had stopped, and the scraping was gone. Maybe it was just a branch, I told myself, or an animal brushing against the cabin. There were plenty of raccoons and deer in these woods. It wasn't unusual for them to wander close. I took a deep breath and stepped back inside, closing the door firmly behind me. I placed the lantern on the kitchen counter and returned to the living area, trying to shake off the lingering unease. But as I sat by the fire, my mind kept going back to the sound. It hadn't been the wind. I was sure of that. And it hadn't sounded like an animal either. It had been too deliberate, too. Heavy. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, but the cabin suddenly felt much smaller, the shadows cast by the fire longer and darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. As the fire began to die down, I decided to head to bed, hoping sleep would take my mind off things. I climbed up the narrow wooden ladder to the loft, where two old beds were tucked under the slanted roof. I picked the one furthest from the window, threw my sleeping bag over the mattress, and lay down, staring up at the wooden beams above me. But sleep didn't come. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind picked up outside, and every noise made my heart race. I couldn't stop thinking about the thud, the scraping, the feeling that something had been outside the cabin, watching. I told myself it was just my imagination. The isolation was playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I woke up with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The cabin was silent. The fire had died out completely, leaving the room in total darkness. I reached for my phone to check the time, 2:17 a.m. I lay there for a moment, listening to the silence, trying to figure out what had woken me up. And then I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak coming from downstairs. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of floorboards groaning under the weight of something, or someone, moving through the cabin. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't heard any windows break, but there was no denying it, something was downstairs. My mind raced, searching for an explanation. Maybe it was just the wind again, or the old wood shifting in the cold night air. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I lay there, completely still, listening to the slow, deliberate creaks coming from the living room. Whatever it was moving slowly, carefully, as if trying not to make too much noise. I grabbed the old lantern I had left by the bed and lit it, the small flame flickering weakly in the darkness. My hands shook as I climbed out of bed and crept toward the ladder, peering down into the living room below. The cabin was empty. The fire had long since gone out, leaving the room in near total darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the lantern in my hand. But then I saw it. The front door. It was wide open, the cold night air blowing into the cabin. I stared at the door, my heart racing, trying to remember if I had locked it before going to bed. I was sure I had. I always locked the door. But now it was standing open, the darkness of the forest beyond it, silent and still. I backed away from the ladder, my hands trembling, and slowly descended, keeping the lantern held high. I didn't know what I expected to find, but every step felt like it took an eternity. When I reached the bottom, I scanned the room. Nothing was out of place. The chairs were still by the fire, the table untouched. But the door, it hadn't been opened before. I approached it slowly, every instinct screaming at me to shut it and lock it. But when I reached for the handle, something stopped me. There, in the soft dirt just outside the door, were footprints. They were large, far too large to be mine, and they led away from the cabin, disappearing into the woods. My blood ran cold. I slammed the door shut, threw the lock, and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea who or what had been outside my cabin that night, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. And I wasn't staying another minute to find out what had been watching me. I grabbed my pack, threw it over my shoulder, and left the cabin, running through the dark forest, the lantern swinging wildly in my hand. I didn't stop until I reached my car, breathless and terrified. I haven't been back to that cabin since. Camping had always been a way for me to escape. It wasn't just about nature, it was about getting away from the pressures of daily life, the endless stream of emails, and the constant noise of the city. I preferred to camp in isolated places, deep in the woods, where I could be alone with my thoughts. That's why I had chosen this particular spot, miles away from any road, at the edge of a small, crystal-clear lake nestled in the middle of a thick forest. The day had been beautiful. I spent the morning hiking, exploring the area around the lake, and in the afternoon I fished by the shore. There wasn't a soul for miles, and the only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface of the water. By the time the sun began to set, casting a soft golden glow over the lake, I felt at peace. I set up my tent just a few yards from the water, the flap facing the lake, so I could wake up to the sunrise over the water. I lit a small fire, cooked a simple dinner, and then sat back to enjoy the fading light as the sky turned from pink to purple, then deepened into the inky black of night. It was one of those nights that felt almost magical. The stars were out in full force, twinkling above the towering trees, and the air was cool but not too cold. I sat by the fire, sipping hot tea and listening to the quiet of the forest. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the starry sky like a mirror. It was everything I had wanted, a night of perfect solitude. But as the fire began to die down, a strange feeling settled over me. It started as a subtle sensation, a vague unease that I couldn't quite place. The kind of feeling you get when you think you've forgotten something important, but you can't remember what it is. I glanced around the clearing, the flickering light of the fire casting long shadows across the trees, but everything looked the same as it had before. The forest was quiet, the lake still. There was nothing out of place. Still, the feeling persisted. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I had spent too much time alone, that was all. My mind was playing tricks on me. I stood up, stretched, and decided it was time to head to bed. I poured the last of my tea into the fire, dousing the remaining flames, and turned toward my tent. That's when I saw it. A shadow. It was just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the weak moonlight, but unmistakably there. A figure, standing perfectly still, half hidden behind one of the tall pine trees. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, staring at the shape. It didn't move. It was just standing there, watching me. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the light, just the way the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting odd shadows. But as I squinted into the darkness, my stomach twisted in fear. It was a person. I couldn't see their face, couldn't make out any details, but there was no doubt about it. Someone was standing at the edge of the clearing, just watching me. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No response. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward, my pulse pounding in my ears. Is someone there? Still nothing. The air felt colder now, and the quiet of the forest, which had been peaceful just moments before, now felt oppressive. The figure remained motionless, a dark silhouette at the edge of my camp, blending into the shadows of the trees. I grabbed my flashlight from my pack, my hands shaking as I flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the clearing, the edge of the camp, but when I pointed it toward the figure, there was nothing there. The shadow was gone. My breath caught in my throat, and I swept the flashlight back and forth, searching the trees for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No rustling of leaves, no sound of footsteps, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I stood there, heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had just seen. Had I imagined it? Was it just a trick of the light? But I knew what I had seen. There had been someone standing there watching me. The feeling of unease grew stronger, and I quickly made my way to my tent, zipping the flap shut behind me. My hands were still trembling as I crawled into my sleeping bag, the flashlight resting beside me within easy reach. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the silence outside. Every little sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, lurking just beyond the trees, watching my tent. But as the minutes ticked by, nothing happened. No footsteps, no voices, no shadows. The forest remained silent, and slowly, I began to convince myself that I had imagined it. Maybe it really had been a trick of the light. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. But the peace didn't last long. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what had woken me up at first. There hadn't been any loud noises, no rustling outside the tent. But as I lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling of the tent, I felt it. Someone was outside. The air in the tent felt thick, oppressive, and my skin prickled with the undeniable sensation that I wasn't alone. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound, any movement. And then I heard it. A soft, shuffling noise coming from just outside the tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving around the perimeter of my camp. My heart raced and I grabbed the flashlight, flicking it on. The light was weak, the batteries already starting to die, but I pointed it toward the tent flap, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped. I sat there, frozen, the flashlight trembling in my hand, waiting for something to happen. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the night. But then, from just outside the tent, I heard it again. A soft whisper. Low, unintelligible, but unmistakably human. My breath caught in my throat, and I clutched the flashlight tighter, my mind racing. Who was out there? What were they doing? I wanted to call out, to ask who it was, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to speak, couldn't bring myself to move. The fear was too overwhelming, too paralyzing. The whisper came again, this time louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from right next to the tent, just inches away from where I sat frozen in terror. I flicked the flashlight off, plunging the tent into darkness, and backed up against the far side of the tent, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting, praying that whoever or whatever was outside would go away. The footsteps resumed, circling the tent slowly, deliberately, and then stopped directly in front of the tent flap. I held my breath, every nerve in my body screaming with fear. The zipper of the tent flap moved, slowly, inch by inch. I shot forward, gripping the zipper and pulling it closed with shaking hands, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could feel the weight of the presence just outside the thin fabric of the tent, the air thick with tension, but I couldn't bring myself to open the flap, to confront whatever was out there. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the presence was gone. The footsteps faded into the distance, disappearing into the quiet of the forest, and the whispering stopped. The oppressive feeling lifted, and the silence of the night returned. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I sat there, huddled in the corner of the tent, the flashlight clutched in my hand, waiting for the footsteps to return. but they never did. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the fabric of the tent, I crawled out, blinking in the pale morning light. The clearing was empty, the lake perfectly still, and there was no sign that anyone had been there during the night. No footprints, no disturbed leaves, nothing. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, my hands still trembling from the fear that had gripped me throughout the night. I didn't bother with breakfast. I didn't even look back at the lake. I just grabbed my gear and left, hiking back to the trailhead as fast as I could. I don't know who or what had been outside my tent that night. I don't know if I had imagined the whole thing or if someone had been watching me, lurking just beyond the trees. But I do know one thing: I haven't camped alone since. And I never will again.